Okta for having me here. This has been such a fun and wonderful conference. I have had a wonderful time here, and I honestly had a lot of fun putting together this presentation also because I got to go out on the trails. How many of you have gotten to join in on those awesome trail treks?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's an excellent time out there. And when you're out there, you get to see these generations of trail markers. The efforts of the people who are preserving our historic trail from the earliest days to ongoing markers that are put up. Even while I was putting together this talk, I got to watch a marker get set in place. So really incredible. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that first effort to mark the historic trail in Wyoming, and some of those trail markers that some of you may have already seen and some of you will get to see on Thursday and Friday. The organized effort to mark the trails in Wyoming really starts with the advocacy from the Daughters of the American Revolution. And really this woman here, Dr. Raymond Hebard, is the key advocate for that. She was quite a formidable woman in Wyoming. I want to read a portion of an article that she wrote in January 1913 is when it was published in the Wyoming School Journal. It appears in her archival record that this was printed elsewhere across the state. And she's talking about the efforts of the daughters to advocate for the state of Wyoming to set aside an appropriation, set aside some money in order to have all of these trails marked. Before she wrote this, there were individuals who had tried to put up markers and monuments, but there was no organized effort in Wyoming to mark the entire trail as it went through the state. She ended that article by writing, "The old Oregon Trail should be marked before all traces of this historic highway are obliterated. Not only the road should have suitable markers placed along its track at stated intervals, but monuments should be erected on the most noted landmarks along the trail. Fort Laramie, Fetterman, Casper, Stambaugh, and Bridger. South Pass and where the trail enters and leaves the state are suggestive locations." When the state of Wyoming and the Daughters of the American Revolution properly mark this part of the old road, which stretched across our continent from the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean, they will be doing honor to those who endured hardships and privations, encountered dangers and peril, who gave up their lives to make possible the civilization of the Great West. So for her, monumenting and marking this trail, it was to honor the people who had made Wyoming possible, who made it possible for her to live in this state, who made the United States, the expansion of the United States possible. The monuments that she was advocating for end up looking like this, these granite stones here. This is a marker that is outside of Lingle. It was placed by the state of Wyoming, that Oregon Trail Commission in 1914. And she spoke at that unveiling, as well as there was a similar monument that was unveiled near Torrington at the same time. And she spoke at that unveiling, and they also had a pioneer picnic afterwards. Of course, here in Okta, we know that the movement to mark those trails did not start in 1913, that she's a little late to the game, about 7 years. Ezra Meeker in 1906 started in on his monument expedition. He has a similar goal as Raymond Hebard. He wants to honor those people who had traveled on the trails. He also wanted to preserve the trails for future generations. That's why I chose that photograph of him with a young child, that he wanted to save the trails for the upcoming people to be able to still see them and visit them and know what came before, why they are able to be where they are. There is a wonderful book on Ezra Meeker. I am not the expert on Ezra Meeker by any stretch of the imagination. Dennis Larson has written an excellent series about Ezra Meeker, and I'd encourage everyone to check this out. This is a wonderful book specifically about his 1906 monument expedition and his efforts to preserve the historic trail. The image that I have there next to him and the child is him nooning on the plains. He includes that photograph in his Ox Team Days book that he published in 1906. And that is situated in the chapters about Wyoming, so I'm assuming that he's nooning on the plains in Wyoming. In 1906, in his monument expedition, Ezra Meeker, he set several monuments in place, and then he put the bug in the ear of several local people that they need to be working on this and putting up monuments themselves. In Wyoming, he put up a monument at South Pass. He talks about scouting out for the perfect rock. He finally finds one on the side of a low hill leading up to a mountain. It is granite, he believes, mixed in with quartz. And he places this marker at Pacific Springs, which is a little bit south of the actual South Pass, where you can see the rivers flowing in their different directions. And he talks about the significance of South Pass. I think those of you who were able to watch Todd Gunther's amazing opening remarks, that was a really incredible speech that he gave. He talked very poignantly about the importance of South Pass and how it opened up the nation for this trail travel, how significant it was to have that gentle passageway over the Continental Divide. Ezra Meeker, he also goes out to the Sweetwater area and he carves in on Independence Rock. I am very curious after my presentation to hear your perspective on his inscription on Independence Rock. As you can see from my photograph of it today, you can hardly see that inscription. You can maybe just barely make out old right there. I think trail is right there. You can just barely see his inscription on there. When he wrote about inscribing on Independence Rock, he envisioned that trail preservationists who came after him would copy over his inscription and make it deeper and then paint in it in order to preserve it well into the future. I'm curious about the various opinions that might be in this room as to whether or not we should leave this as we leave the other historic markers in his own hand. That is the last person to inscribe that was Ezra Meeker. That's pretty cool. We will eventually lose that to the elements as we have lost so many other historic inscriptions and paintings on Independence Rock. Eventually this will wear down. Or, if you believe that we should be honoring his wish, do you think that we should be making that a deeper inscription, painting it in every year, and making it a bold feature on Independence Rock? I don't quite have my opinion formed on that yet, so I'm curious to hear what you all believe. Ezra Meeker visiting the Sweetwater was a really special time for him. He goes over to Devil's Gate and he tries to find the location of his brother's grave. He says that all that remains of the mortal coil of his brother's soul is there in the sands of next to the Devil's Gate at the Sweetwater. And in 1906, he was unable to find that grave. He also talks about camping along the Sweetwater and the difference from camping in 1852 when he first went over the trails to now, all of a sudden, camping where there's nobody traveling on the trails in 1906. I want to read his description of the Sweetwater to you all. The sight of the Sweetwater River, 20 miles out from South Pass, revived many pleasant memories and some that were sad. I could remember the sparkling clear water, the green skirt of undergrowth along the banks, and the restful camps as we trudged along up the stream so many years ago. And now I saw the same channel, the same hills, and apparently the same water swiftly passing. But where were the campfires? Where was the herd of gaunt cattle? Where the sound of the din of bells, the hallowing for lost children, or the little groups off on the hillside to bury the dead? All were gone. An oppressive silence prevailed as we drove to the river and pitched our camp within a few feet of the bank, where we could hear the rippling waters passing and see the fish leaping in the eddies. We had our choice of camping place just by the skirt of a refreshing green brush with an opening to give full view of the river. It had not been so 54 years before. With hundreds of camps ahead of you, the traveler then must take what he could get. And that, in many cases, would be a place far back from the water and removed from other conveniences. He goes on to talk about missing the smells and the sights of these camps and walking through these camps, but concludes that the country remains the same as it was in 52. The trail is to be seen miles and miles ahead, worn bare and deep, but with one narrow track where there used to be dozen, and with the beaten path that vegetation has not yet recovered from the scourge of passing hooves and the tires of wagons years ago. It's incredible, his description of the Sweetwater, and he and I have very different opinions of being out there. Growing up in Wyoming, the Sweetwater to me is that oppressive. I don't think it's oppressive. It's that beautiful silence that you're out there by yourself. And what an incredible, wonderful experience to be out there on the prairie by yourself. And when I'm out there, I try to imagine what it would be like to be traveling in the 1850s. And to me, it would be so miserable. That long line of people, you can't see the end of them ahead of you, you can't see the end of them behind you, the dust. You have to camp so far back from the river and hauling that water to and from your camp. No, thank you. Give me the trail today, is what I say. Ezra Meeker, in order to accomplish his national goals, he had to work with local people. And you can imagine that what is happening in Wyoming with Ezra Meeker is happening all over the country in different states. He worked with Grace Raymond Hebard. That is what this letter is from. There's 24 letters in her correspondence file with Ezra Meeker that I've transcribed. And there's several others that are hiding in other files that she has, over a dozen files of the work that she did on the Oregon Trail in her archives. In his letters, he talks about the work of setting up the monuments. What's going to happen next? Are they getting money for this? Where they can get money? Which different groups might be able to help them? They should ask the county commissioners and things like that. He's giving her advice as to how to accomplish the work. Later on, he writes to her, as does his proofreader, for some of his later books, asking for her advice and for her to check the facts to see whether or not he has the dates and the locations right for the Bozeman Trail and the Bloody Bozeman Red Cloud's War. So he's asking her to be a historian for him, to help him out. And he also had plans. I wish that he had succeeded and found the funding for it. He had plans to produce a film on the Oregon Trail at a certain point. And he asks Dr. Hebard, he writes to her and says, can you give me a list of all of the locations that would be good to film in Wyoming, and also all of the contacts of people that I would need to be in touch with in order to film in those locations. And she prepares this long list for him of the different spots that she thinks must be included if you're going to be filming on the Oregon Trail in Wyoming. He also works with H.G. Nickerson, who is the president of the Wyoming Oregon Trails Commission, and he is an old-timer of Wyoming. I'll be sharing just a little bit more about him in a second here. And they work together to actually putting up those physical monuments. That is the work that H.G. Nickerson is doing, and that is a lot of what Meeker was doing when he was going back and forth over the trails with his ox team and his wagon automobile, and he didn't set up any markers when he flew over the trail, but I'm sure he thought about it. Other states served as inspiration for Wyoming to take on the work of marking the historic trails. Dr. Hebard, in her article advocating for the appropriation, she says that Missouri set aside $3,000. In 1909, New Mexico already began marking the historic trails. 1912, Colorado joins and sets aside $2,000 for the marking of their trails. And at that point, by 1913, Kansas had 89 markers already set up. She says, Wyoming is late to the game. We need to hurry up and join the rest of the nation in marking the trail as it came through our state before we lose it completely. This, of course, led to some collaboration between the states. There is collaboration between Wyoming and Idaho, especially the Daughters of the American Revolution. They crossed the state borders quite a bit, and they set up a monument right at the border between Wyoming and Idaho. They also work with the Nebraska-Wyoming Sons and Daughters of the American Revolution. Both organizations across state lines work together to set up a monument that's just south of Henry, Nebraska, but on the Wyoming side of that line. And that was done in April 4th, 1913. And then the images that you are seeing here, these are from the overland marker that was set up at the Wyoming-Colorado state line. And that was also a collaboration between the Daughters of the American Revolution in both of those locations. Those of you who are familiar with my other research that I've done know that I have worked quite a bit on the Wyoming state flag. That's one of the articles that Tom mentioned is on wyohistory.org. And I found out something new when I was digging into this research that will have to make me adjust my perceptions a little bit on it. This event, July 4th, 1917, the Wyoming state flag had just been signed into law January 31st, 1917. Dr. Hebard claims that this is the first event where the Wyoming state flag was publicly displayed. So her advocacy was extremely successful. The state of Wyoming, in 1913, that session, they decide to set aside the $2,500 that she was asking for and create the Oregon Trail Commission. She does not sit on the first Oregon Trail Commission. The people who are appointed by the governor of Wyoming, Herman Gold Nickerson as the president of the commission, and Emily Patton as the secretary. Emily Patton, at the time, she was serving as the state regent for the Daughters of the American Revolution. And she was really quite a force all of her own. She helped to build the hospital in Cheyenne. She was a part of several different local groups that wanted to improve the communities. And I'm not sure why. I believe that her husband gets a position in Washington, D.C. around 1914, and she leaves the state of Wyoming. She left a lot of work undone in the state of Wyoming. She had spent that $2,500 buying quite a few monuments and markers. Many of them were brought out to the location where they needed to lay, or they were actually brought to the towns that were close by, and that's where they sat. They were laying down on the ground. They were not set up or put into place. When Grace Raymond Hebard takes over for her as the secretary of the Oregon Trail Commission in 1915, she writes to her rather anxiously saying, "You've done such good work, and I hate to see it left undone, that Nickerson's health is failing. It's really touch and go with him and his health, and we want to make sure that these markers are put up, that the Mr. Burnett that Patton was working with to set up the Bozeman Trail markers, he believes his job is done. He hauled the stones out to where they need to be, and that is that, and he's not going to do anything more." Patton writes back and says, "Oh, I am sure that you can accomplish this through correspondence." That you have contacts in all of these locations, and just reach out to the ranchers in the locations, and those old ranchers, they'll be happy to haul those stones out and place them for you. So just ride around and you'll be able to figure it out, I'm sure. So when Dr. Hebard took over the Oregon Trail Commission, her goal was to finish the work that had already been started, that she wanted to see those monuments set into place. And the person who was responsible for setting a lot of these monuments into place was the president of the commission, Herman Gold Nickerson. So H.G. Nickerson, he is a longtime resident in the state of Wyoming. He was born in the 1840s in Ohio. He was 20 years old in 1861 when he served in the Civil War for the Union. He was promoted during the Civil War to captain of his Ohio unit that he was serving in. And then after the Civil War, because of his health, it appears that he always was struggling a little bit with his health, even at a young age. He goes out to that fresh mountain air. And he's working on the Bozeman Trail. He's running freight down the Bozeman Trail. He remembers that he's one of the first people to run freight down that trail. And when they were running that freight line, he recalls that the gentleman ahead of him was attacked and killed by the Lakota. The gentleman behind him was attacked and killed by the Lakota, and that he didn't find out about it until he actually got to camp that night. Soon he moves out to the South Pass, that Gold Rush area in 1868, and he runs for the first Wyoming territorial legislature in 1869, fails to get that, but he runs for the second territorial legislature, and there he is a very key vote which saves women's suffrage in Wyoming. Now, when it comes to women's suffrage in Wyoming is when we have a little air of suspicion cast over H.G. Nickerson. How reliable is this man? That for the past 70 years, there's a historian who has passed away, but his work is the dominant narrative, and he says that H.G. Nickerson is not a very reliable man, that he can't be trusted. The stories he's telling about women's suffrage, he's telling tales out of school. But if you talk to the trail people about H.G. Nickerson and you say, how reliable is he? Are those monuments in the right location? Are his inscriptions in the right location? And they're going to tell you, yes, they are. I think that we can, this is one of the monuments that he did put up for women's suffrage. It says, site of office and home of Esther Morris, first woman justice of peace, author of female suffrage in Wyoming. I don't necessarily know if he means literal author or if he's talking more generally and spiritually or universally as the author of women's suffrage. He said that she was the advocate for that here in Wyoming. So is he accurate? I tend to believe him based on the correspondence between him and Dr. Hebard. There are over 90 letters in their correspondence file alone, and again, that's not counting all of the other letters that appear in her different records that didn't get filed in with that correspondence file. And in those 90 letters, they are mostly fact-checking each other, saying, this old-timer told me this story about the trail or about this fort being located here, or that this is what is in this picture here. What do you think? And coming back and saying, oh no, he's badly mistaken. That's not South Pass City, that's Atlantic City. They're always going back and forth trying to get what they think is the most accurate story. And sometimes they didn't meet the mark, and most of the time I think they did. Nickerson, he sets up a monument next to Ezra Meeker's in that Pacific area in South Pass. And his monument is to Narcissa Whitman and Eliza Spaulding, the first white women to cross the Continental Divide. And again, Todd Gunther spoke so poignantly about the way that those women opened up trail travel and how important they were. Leading up to him placing that monument are letters between him and Dr. Hebard where she is saying, we really need to put something up to respect and honor these women who came through. And very clearly, H.G. Nickerson, who saved women's suffrage in 1871, he is someone who is a big advocate for women's rights and respecting, honoring women's history. So he hauls that stone out there. I'm very grateful to have listened to Dick Reek speak before me because I was a little bit curious about his letters. He hauls that stone out there June 28, 1916, and he said that he was contending with feet and banks of snow. He was delayed from the snow. He was also delayed that year in 1916. He and his wife were in a terrible car accident. He goes through a series of unfortunate events that he's struggling with his rheumatism. He has been in a few car accidents and is trying to recover from those. You can imagine the safety features on those vehicles not what they are today, even though they weren't hitting the speeds we hit today. And his wife was very badly injured in that car accident in 1916. And so he's delayed in being able to put up these markers and monuments. It takes him a long time to be able to do those inscriptions with his rheumatism. That is a lot of hard work to chisel in those letters. And sometimes he gets it started and then he has to have someone else finish it for him. He says that this monument, it took him 2 days to chisel that inscription into the stone. And then you have to imagine the physical work of hauling those stones, bringing them out to the area, and setting them into concrete. At the time, there's a triangle of letters that happened between Ezra Meeker, H.G. Nickerson, and Grace Hebard talking about setting these stones in concrete, and he was setting Ezra Meeker's stone in concrete too. Ezra Meeker was quite upset because of that highwayman who had destroyed his monument. So sometime between 1906 and 1916, a highwayman had gone by, knocked over Ezra Meeker's marker, and in 1916, Nickerson came back out, reset the stone, and placed it in concrete. And there those two monuments are still today. Nickerson also left several inscriptions along the trail. I had a lot of fun going out with Randy Brown and checking out these inscriptions. We're going opposite of the trail did. We're going west to east because Nickerson was based out of Lander, and so that's the way that he's traveling down the trail to make these inscriptions. So this is at the 3 crossings on the Sweetwater River, which I believe one of these trail treks is going to in the next couple of days. So if you're out there, lots of mosquitoes and great brush all built up there. And if you peer through the trees, you'll be able to see Nickerson's marker talking about the Oregon-California Trail, and he gives the dates 1843 to 49. As we travel further east, we come upon Nickerson Pass, as dubbed by Randy Brown and used by Lee Underbrink. That's what they lovingly called this pass of the trail. And there's an inscription from Nicky there. That's why I'm calling these inscriptions Nicky's inscriptions, because the trail guys who are out there and actually see them every day and work with them, or not every day, but see them regularly and work with them and know all about Nickerson. He's like a friend. Old Nicky out there with putting his markers on the trail. So you can see the lichen built up over that Oregon-California Trail. 1914 is when he carved that in. And then his initials down there he put on Nickerson Pass, that HGN. And if you're looking at the rock itself, that's where the main inscription is, and then his initials down low there. Further east, he has an inscription at Rattlesnake Pass that is leading into the Devil's Gate, Martins Cove area, and there's some great inscriptions all through the hills on the boulders and rocks in there. He also does not put his name. He puts Oregon-California Trail 1843-9, and then the year that he put that inscription in there, 1914. He leaves several inscriptions on Independence Rock. One of them that's somewhat visible today. On the north face of the rock, he inscribes Grace Raymond Hebard's name, as well as his own and his classic Oregon-California Trails inscription. And then he also inscribes his name towards the south side on a boulder that's set apart a little bit from the rock. I have walked right by it several times, knowing it's there, looking for it. If it's the right time of day or stormy weather, overcast or something, you might be able to spot it right off and see it really well. I haven't gotten a good picture of it yet. So Nickerson, he was out there doing that physical hard labor, that work of setting up these markers and monuments, while Grace Raymond Hebard, she was handling the correspondence and the financial side of things. She, of course, is the original advocate to get that $2,500 along with the Daughters of the American Revolution, that institution behind her, that appropriation, and then every year she had to go back to the legislature and ask them for more money. And they would give her $500 each year. She didn't spend all of that money during World War I. She allowed most of it to revert back to the state. And part of the reason for that is because she's a deeply patriotic woman. She believed that the state needed that money for something else during the war effort rather than the trails, although she still had to advocate to get it in order to keep the commission going. And the other reason for that is that as a deeply patriotic woman, she was very busy with the war effort during that time. So she did not immediately have the time on her hands to be doing this kind of trail work. She's writing with individual ranchers, landowners, the county commissioners. She is writing to trail pioneers, old soldiers. She writes to the 3 of the soldiers who fought in the wagon box fight, the last 3 living soldiers who had fought in that battle. And she's trying to locate, where is the wagon box fight? Where did it happen? In order to set up markers or monuments there. In this sheet here, we see that the Oregon Trail Commission gave $55 to S.S. Gibbons for him coming out in 1919 to locate the wagon box fight. But I know from correspondence that much more money was exchanged than that. There are letters exchanged between Dr. Hebard and these soldiers where she's trying to figure this out, and the first letter is quite stands off that, yes, I do have this information, but I need to be paid for it. And I'm not going to give this for free. I've written a manuscript. I can't get anybody to publish it. And I want to be paid for this work. And Dr. Hebard writes back. She says, yes, of course. You definitely need to be paid. I want you to understand what our financial situation is. The state of Wyoming set aside $500 this year. So far this year, I have spent $800 of my own money. I will gladly pay you for your manuscript. It will be coming from my own personal funds. Dr. Hebard, she was a very successful woman. She came to the state of Wyoming in 1882. She was 21 years old, which was voting age, so she was always able to vote as an adult living in Wyoming. She worked in the general land office as a draftsman, taking the notes from the surveyors and turning them into maps. That's how she fell in love with the history of Wyoming and really got to know the state and the people who live here. Then she went on to the university in the 1890s, where she took on several important roles building up the University of Wyoming. She grew the library collection from 500 books to over 60,000 books, created a traveling library to spread that education across Wyoming and improve rural education. She served as the secretary to the Board of Trustees, handling the finances of the university for essentially its first 20 years of existence. And she was a professor at the university as well. She made good money doing that work, but she did not live a luxurious life. She invested most of that money into upbuilding the university, helping out students who couldn't afford their tuition, and preserving the historic trails, building up Wyoming. This is one of the projects that she pours a lot of her own personal money into in order to make it possible. She also is great at gathering together information. She puts together this wonderful book in 1921, marking the Oregon Trail, the Bozeman Road, and historic places in Wyoming. She catalogs over 80 different markers and monuments across the state that were put up between 1908, and 1920 across the state of Wyoming. Oh, yes. I love that. I'm getting ready to talk about them too. So perfect timing on their part. She also took place in most of the unveiling ceremonies, celebrating the setting in place of these markers and monuments, talking to crowds of hundreds of people. This monument, she says, at Independence Rock. This is on the north face of Independence Rock. In 1914, the stone was erroneously placed on the east side of the North Platte, supposedly on the trail. The commissioners of Natrona County donated their services to removing the stone to the north side of Independence Rock, just below the tablet placed on the rock on July 4th by the Masons. They were the ones who were out there celebrating on July 4th in 1920, embedded the granite marker in a foundation of cement. At these unveiling ceremonies, they generally had a historian, usually Dr. Hebard or someone else, who would come in and share their research on those historic trails. And then they'd also have a pioneer come in. So here they are, July 4th, 1920. Dr. Hebard is in the middle there. Next to her, B.B. Brooks, the governor of the state of Wyoming. He spoke at that unveiling ceremony. Next to him is a woman who is a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, Mrs. Cooper. On the other side of Dr. Hebard here, we have Mrs. B.B. Brooks, Mary Brooks, who's also in the Daughters of the American Revolution. And then we have John C. Friend, who is an Oregon Trail pioneer, coming to share his memories of the trail. It's been quite fun for me to get to be here at this conference and see the continuation of these traditions, that we have our historians come and speak. We have our representatives from the federal government, our BLM and National Park Service people come and speak. And we also have the descendants of different pioneers come and share their stories. And that's what's happening next door here. The descendant of Howard Driggs, who had put together a great celebration on Independence Rock in 1830, she is sharing that story of that celebration on Independence Rock. And how fun to see that continuation of bringing in these descendants to share that story, that we really want to hear these family histories. Dr. Hebard, she wasn't just doing the work behind the scenes of getting the money and trying to figure out who would put the stones in place. She actually got to go out on the trails and put some stones in place for herself in 1915. She goes on a trail expedition. On that trail expedition, she meets up with H.G. Nickerson. There they are, standing in the middle of the trail, Dr. Hebard and Nickerson. She also brings along her brother Frederick, who's in this photograph here, and her sister Alice. Frederick and her are pointing at the name that H.G. Nickerson carved into the north face of Independence Rock for her. An organization came along and placed a bronze plaque right on top of that. It is in honor of Dr. Hebard, that bronze plaque, but they did set it right on top of that inscription. And behind his head, you see that classic Nickerson, Oregon, and California Trail inscription, and in his back, Captain H.G.N. Lander, 1914. And there you have Dr. Hebard sitting next to the automobile that they were driving out there. It's quite funny. She and her sister are pretty opposite people. She was definitely a gung-ho, adventurous gal. She talks about riding up front with the driver that they had hired to take them out into these trails and trying to see how fast she can get that car to go. And that he's really pushing it. He's almost going 30 miles an hour. And her sister's in the back freaking out, saying, "Can we please slow down?" And she's in the front seat saying, "Come on, let's go a little bit faster." So they had a really fun time on the trail on that journey. In August, they make it out towards Daniel, Wyoming, which is on the western side of the state. And there they're putting up a boulder monument for Fort Bonneville. It was a lot of fun getting to go out on the trail with Randy Brown and hearing some about his research and how he's located different graves or different historic places around the state. Reminded me a little of how H.G. Nickerson and Grace Raymond Hebard located Fort Bonneville. That when Randy Brown was looking for the graves of those people who were massacred on the Shepherd's Train in 1859, he thought he found the right location, and he went up to the rancher to ask him about it, and he said, "How do you know about those graves?" But the ranchers, they had been out there since around about the 1880s, and they had known about or earlier than that, I think just a few, about 8 or so years after the Shepherd's Train massacre. Those ranchers came out there and started working that land, that property. And so they knew about those graves and had handed down the story of who they were and where they were from family to family. When Nickerson and Grace Hebard go out to try and find Fort Bonneville, or they're riding around, sending out correspondence, trying to find the location of it, it's the ranchers who know exactly where it is because it's on their property. I want to read a little bit from her 1915 journal of the trip in Wyoming, following and marking the trails, and talking about the work of putting up this boulder. The evening before, we were fortunate enough to meet at the store Dr. Montrose in his auto. Here we questioned him in regard to obtaining a suitable boulder for an appropriate monument for the site of Fort Bonneville. And much to our joy, he told us that during the winter, he snaked down a great boulder across Green River on the ice in accordance with the suggestion I made to him last fall. We promised to be out to his place 6 miles west early in the morning. It is on his ranch we found the site of Fort Bonneville. And then that day she writes, "We found Dr. Montrose's ranch, but no sign of the fort. There is nothing on the prairie except a few small trees and the handsome stone which Dr. Montrose hauled, together with a great many. A granite boulder about 4 or 5 foot high, which might weigh 2 tons. We drove over to Dr. Montrose's, met his wife and a Mr. Kelly, and returned with these to the site where altogether, with self included, and Otto pulling at the stone, we finally succeeded in getting it in the location desired, though upside down. Cole pulled the auto into shape so as to have a shade for Colonel N and me, while we blocked out the letters upside down stone. The letters were about 2 inches high, and we worked all of 3 hours on the inscription. I helped and went over each letter with chisel and mallet, and with a small paintbrush, painted the letters black." The setting of a monument, quite the work that goes into that. And quite the fun discoveries that can happen when you are out there on those ranches. That while they were setting this stone, Mr. Cole, who is out there with them, did a little bit of digging, and he found what she's drawing there, a post from the stockade. And she believes that that was the most significant evidence that they had found for Fort Bonneville. And they were very accurate with that location of the fort. Amazing to me. Benjamin Bonneville, he constructed that in 1832 in August of that year, and then he abandoned it in September of the same year. So it was a very short-lived fort, not a long-lived monument, and here they are, oh goodness, over 80 years later, accurately finding the location. And we know that they're accurate because in the 1990s, they did a little bit of investigating, archaeological digging out there, and they confirmed that that is Fort Bonneville. While reading the letters, the correspondence between Nickerson and Grace Hebard, I became quite emotional about and invested in their journey. Nickerson, one of his big goals, he was a real big fan of John C. Fremont. He is the reason why that area in Wyoming is Fremont County. He is the one who made it be named Fremont County. And he wanted to go to Fremont's Peak, set up a monument and a flag for Fremont on top of Fremont's Peak. And every year he's writing to her about these plans, and they're making like actual plans. He has the lockbox. He wants to have a logbook where people can write their name that they ascended the peak. He wants to put up placards that have the letters from Fremont in them so people can read and actually see these letters from Fremont. And every year it's just, oh, his health isn't quite good enough to make it up there. Or, oh, it just didn't work out with the timing, and the guy that they hired to bring the horses won't make it. They have so much work that they were doing together, he and Grace Raymond Hebard. And I want to I want to share the last letter that Nickerson sends to Grace Hebard with you all. That he was in quite poor health. It's 1927. He went to the hospital, and they told him that he was too old to operate on. And he is writing to Dr. Hebard on his deathbed. Afterwards, she receives a few letters from his daughter, who is handling the rest of his business and correspondence. Let's see, here it is. So, April 2nd, 1927. My dear Miss Hebard, it is with a sad, sad heart that I am writing you these few lines. I was sent to hospital. X-rays showed ulcers of the stomach. Being too old, 86, to be operated on, I have but a short time until the ulcers do their work. I am in the hands of a nurse and handled like a child. The troops, and then he changes quite. There's no anything in between this letter. It just jumps from talking about his health into talking about the work that they've been doing. The troops leaving Lander is plain, but the picture called Agency and Fort Washakie has not been identified. Later they will be sent to you. So his mind, even on his deathbed, his mind is still about the work that they were doing together. He closes with 2 lines. My memory is gone. Goodbye. H.G. Nickerson. And that was our first generation of trail markers, trail preservationists, who made it possible for all of us today to be able to go out and check out the trail today. It's fascinating to me to be able to go out there and see it. We have a photograph here from the cave on Independence Rock that has the tar and painted names in there. Imagine Independence Rock in the 1850s and how it's described. Name on top of name on top of name, and then drive a little bit further on down that highway and stop in at a gas station at around Muddy Gap and find the same exact thing as described on Independence Rock on the walls, all over the shelves, on the ceiling, everywhere in this gas station. People are writing the name on top of name on top of name. Human nature does not change. I think if we can give people more outlets like this gas station at Muddy Gap, maybe we can save our Register Cliff and Independence Rock and keep the historic ones on there. And just like Ezra Meeker described the trail in 1852, that there used to be several lines of trail, now there's just maybe one solid 2-track road, which is so incredible. It's incredible to be able to drive on the Oregon Trail, that road has been actively in use since before around the 1830s. That's incredible that the ranchers continue to use the trail. You still get to go out and visit that trail, drive on the Oregon-California road. And there's H.G. Nickerson and Grace Raymond Hebard standing in the middle of the trail. I had to get Randy Brown to pose with me. I set my camera up on the hood of his car out in front of Nickerson Pass there in order to get a similar sort of shot. And this is a really gorgeous section of the trail where you can see that is the trail splitting the different decisions that they had to make. Eventually it just meets right back up. That's not a major cutoff or anything like that. It's just these small decisions along the way. And as an organization, we have our own small decisions to make along the way. I think that looking to our past, it is evident that this work cannot be done alone, that a private organization cannot handle this all by ourselves. We need to partner with these government agencies, with these local governments, and with the private citizens, and most especially and importantly, the property owners, the landowners, where the trail is going on their land in order to preserve and protect that trail. When you go out there today, the dominant marker that you are going to see are the markers that have been put in place by Randy Brown. This is a gorgeous section of the trail that goes through National Guard property into private property, and those swales are really incredible. You can follow those swales and trail ruts for miles, the same stretch of trail. It's we're really lucky in Wyoming to have this, and it's because of OCTA, this wonderful organization, that this section of the trail is marked, thanks to the efforts of OCTA and Randy Brown. So I want to close by giving a huge thank you to Randy Brown, who took me out on the trail to see those inscriptions and was incredibly generous with his knowledge there. Check out what he has written in the Overland Journal. And I also got to take part in being the new generation of trail preservationists. I got to help, or I don't know how much helping I did, but got to be out there when Randy Brown put up one of those OCTA markers. So thank you so much. Thank you to the Oregon-California Trails Association, and keep doing the good work that you're doing.